Fish 06. Purusa, consciousness, awareness. Preamble. Those who are familiar with traditional Indian philosophical systems will realize that this chapter, concerning Purusa, and the previous chapter, regarding Prakriti, examine the ontological dualism of mind versus matter, that has been a common topic in metaphysics, in both the East, especially in Bharata and in China, and in the West, especially since French philosopher René Descartes' postulation that the world comprises two distinct and incompatible classes of substance, res extensa, or extended substance, which extends through space, and res cogitans, or rational substance, which has no extension in space. This Cartesian dualism is closely aligned to, if not identical with, the mind-body problem in philosophy of mind, which is an attempt to investigate the perplexing relationship between mental properties and physical properties. The Sanskrit term, Purusa, literally, man, spirit, person, self, or consciousness, is a rather complex concept, and it has a plethora of interpretations in Vedic thought, but in this chapter, it is used according to perhaps its most common definition, and that is, the cosmic spirit, or pure subjectivity, in contrast to Prakriti, which is material nature, or the objective, phenomenal universe. And because nothing whatever can be said of pure subjectivity, Brahman, in Sanskrit, or the Tao, in Chinese, since the subject of all subjects is not an objective thing that can possibly be described with dualistic, pluralistic language, this chapter, in the main, is necessarily an exposition of discrete consciousness. If not, the only thing that could be said of Purusa is, the Purusa of which can be spoken, is not the real Purusa, in order to paraphrase Tao Te Ching. Furthermore, those misguided commentators who adhere to the metaphysical schema of idealism, will find much here to substantiate their somewhat flawed understanding of ultimate reality, and hopefully, eventually come to recognize that idealism is a relatively incomplete metaphysics, in favor of the related but far more robust schema of dual aspect monism, Advaita, in Sanskrit. In order to understand these conceptual frameworks, read the entries, object, subject, Advaita, idealism, and monism, in the glossary of this sole holy scripture. Consciousness, defined. The English language word, consciousness, means the state of being aware, or that which knows, or even more literally, characterized by knowing, from the Latin prefix, con, with the stem, sire, to know, and the suffix, osus, characterized by. To put it succinctly, the phenomenon of consciousness refers to the subjective component of any subject-object relationship. Moreover, there is a hierarchy of localized knowing, within the cognitive faculty of vertebrates, that is, a hierarchy of subject-object relationships, as well as a more universal awareness, more appositely called Brahman, or Sakhidananda, in Sanskrit, or Tao, in Chinese, as explicated in the following paragraphs. Whilst universal consciousness, again, better termed, Brahman, is essentially impersonal, individualized, discrete consciousness is invariably personal, i.e., it is expressed strictly via the complex brain configuration of the more highly evolved animal species, particularly vertebrates. Higher species of animal life have sufficient cognitive ability to know themselves and their environment, at least to a measurable degree. Just where consciousness objectively begins in the animal kingdom, is a matter of contention, but judging purely by ethological means, it probably starts with vertebrates, at least the higher order birds, reptiles and fishes. Those metazoans that are evolutionarily lower than vertebrates, do not possess much, if any, semblance of intellect, necessary for genuine knowledge, but operate purely by reflexive instincts, notwithstanding certain notable exceptions to this rule, such as octopuses. For instance, an insect or a jellyfish does not consciously decide to seek food, but does so according to its base instincts, directed by its idiosyncratic genetic code. Even when an insect, such as a cockroach, flees from danger, it is not experiencing the anxious emotions that a human or other mammal would experience. See Chapter 11, regarding the concept of will. Sentience evolves into true consciousness. Undoubtedly, the lower species of animals, alluded to above, embody, if not true consciousness, varying degrees of sentience, depending on how many senses it possesses and how complex is its nervous system. Very few would consider a blind worm to be more sentient than a frog. Plants are also sentient, but use lower-level mechanisms for their perceptions. To give just a couple of examples, both land-based and water-borne plants respond to sunlight, as witnessed by the opening of flowers upon the rising of the sun, and some carnivorous plants can detect arthropods crawling on their leaves. Therefore, when carnists claim that plants have feelings too, they may be justified, according to some ambiguous sense of the term. So the most logical reason for being vegan is not because plants are completely insentient, but simply due to the fact that humans are an herbivorous species. No sane person would advocate for veganism if humans were omnivores. Furthermore, fruit trees indirectly benefit from the consumption of its fruit, since their seeds are spread. So, those carnists who criticize vegans for killing sentient plants for their sustenance ought to know that it is indeed possible to consume a nutritious diet without killing any living being whatever. I, personally, have been completely frugivorous for lengthy periods of time, and those periods were, by far, the healthiest times of my entire life. Those with an ounce of nous will question the above claim that lower species of animals, insects, just for a start, are without consciousness, although, to be fair, the adjective true was used to qualify the noun consciousness, since most all insects have eyes and other senses, so there seems to be the subject-object relationship, vital to the definition of the term consciousness. Of course, that seems to be a valid thesis, but in the opinion of this author, the degree of consciousness exhibited by such lower creatures is most accurately seen to be purely electromechanical in nature. A wasp detects a wall in its flight path, and automatically flies around it, without any thought processes being involved whatsoever. Obviously, if one prefers to refer to the wasp as a conscious agent, that would be acceptable, but at some point, there needs be a line drawn in the animal kingdom between sentience and consciousness, for it would be truly absurd to call a bacterium conscious, I would contend. This may explain the reason why microbes were lately given their own kingdom, in addition to the fungi, animal, and plant kingdoms, since a microbe is, strictly speaking, neither a plant nor an animal, though it may embody features of both the major kingdoms of living beings. Just as it is impossible to discern the precise micrometer where the trunk of a tree becomes a root of the same tree, it is extremely difficult, if not impossible, to point to the exact division between sentience and consciousness, for the latter is an extension of the former, in the same way that the trunk of a fig tree is an extension of the root system, or in the same way that a freshwater river merges into a saltwater estuary. When crustaceans, amphibians, most reptiles, and most birds flee from danger, they're exhibiting a purely mechanical, fight or flight, response, not dissimilar to a carnivorous plant's reaction to the feeling, see the glossary entry, sentience, which refers to sensual feeling, of an insect crawling on its leaves. When those animals that are truly conscious, as opposed to merely sentient, display the same behavior, it may be accompanied by rudimentary emotions, such as grief, anxiety, fear, and confusion, due to the appropriate parts of the brain being developed to a higher degree. Human beings, who have the most advanced brains of all animal species in the history of our planet, are capable of emotions that are so innovative that they could be considered detrimental to our contentment, such as the fear and anticipation we feel concerning events that have yet to eventuate. Personally, in my own past, I have dreamed up a host of possible negative scenarios that might take place in the future, yet failed to eventuate, and the fear and dread I experienced was all for naught. Hence, an extra layer of suffering is practically unavoidable for species that have a particularly advanced level of consciousness, such as Homo sapiens, and possibly our ancestors. Consciousness research. Recently, consciousness has become a significant topic of interdisciplinary research in cognitive science, involving fields such as philosophy of mind, psychology, linguistics, anthropology, neuropsychology, and neuroscience. Many such researchers have seen evidence that the brain is merely a conduit, or a transducer, of consciousness, explaining why the more intelligent the animal, the more it can understand its own existence, or at least be aware of more of its environment, Just see how amazingly complex dolphin and whale behavior can be, compared with other aquatic species, and the reason why it is asserted that a truly enlightened human must possess a far higher level of intelligence than the average person. See Chapter 17 Re. The distinction between enlightenment and mere awakening. The processor of a supercomputer must necessarily be far larger in size, more complex, and more powerful than the processing unit in a pocket calculator, obviously. Therefore, it seems logical to extrapolate that the scale of discrete, localized, consciousness is chiefly dependent on the brain capacity of a specific animal. So, then, in response to the assertion made in the previous paragraph, one could easily complain thus: that's not fair. Why can only a genius be enlightened? As defined in Chapter 17. The answer is, first of all, as stated above, every species of animal has its own level of intelligence, on a wide-ranging scale. Therefore, a pig or a dog could, if possible, ask, that is unfair, why can only a human being become enlightened? Secondly, it is indeed a fact that life is unfair, because there is no tit-for-tat law of action and reaction, even if many supposedly illuminated religious preceptors have stated so. They said so, because they were preaching to wicked miscreants, who refused to quit their evil ways, and needed to be chastised in a forceful manner, and also due to the fact that those gurus were themselves less than fully enlightened. It is not possible to speak sweet and gentle words to a rabid dog, to prevent it from biting you, and likewise with the majority of animalistic humans. The three states of prehension. Three states of awareness are experienced by humans, and possibly all other species of mammals, as well as many kinds of reptiles and birds. The waking state, Jagrata, in Sanskrit, dreaming, Svapna, in Sanskrit, and the deep sleep or dreamless sleep state, Susupti, in Sanskrit. Human dreaming occurs mostly, but not exclusively, in the state known as REM, rapid eye movement, sleep. During this phase, the electrical activity in the brain is more like waking than sleeping. That is why this state is often called paradoxical sleep. Scientists have discovered that most non-human animals, mammals, birds, reptiles, and most recently, fish, also experience REM sleep. The electrical activity found in the brains of these creatures during rapid eye movement sleep is similar to that of humans while they dream, suggesting that animals may dream. Some cognitive psychologists may claim that there are transitional states between waking, dreaming, and deep sleep, but these states are just that, transitory states between the three main states, in the same way that sunrise, daylight, daytime, and sunset have transitional states. Furthermore, there exists the well-known phenomenon of lucid dreaming, where the subject is aware of the fact that a dream is taking place. Beyond these three temporal states of waking, dreaming, and deep sleep, is the fourth state, Turiya, or Katuriya, in Sanskrit. This is the unconditioned, timeless state that underlies the other three, and is therefore completely transcendental to any temporal state whatsoever. The waking state is the least real, that is to say the least permanent, or to put it another way, the farthest from the necessary foundation of existence, as explained towards the end of this chapter. The dream state is closer to our eternal, essential nature, whilst dreamless deep sleep is much more analogous to the universal self, Brahman, as it is imbued with peace. Rather than being an absence of awareness, deep sleep is an awareness of absence, that is, the absence of phenomenal, sensual experiences. So, in actual fact, the fourth state is not a state, but the unconditioned ground of being, or to put it simply, Brahman, or existence awareness peace, Sachidananda, in Sanskrit. Perhaps the main purpose of dreams is so that we can understand that the waking state is practically indistinguishable from the dream state, and thereby come to see the illusory nature of this ephemeral world. Both our waking state experiences and our dream state experiences occur solely within the mental faculties. Refer to Chapter 04 for an elucidation of this phenomenon. If somebody in one of your dreams was to ask your dream state character if the dream was real, you, playing the part of that character, would most likely say, yes, of course it is real. Likewise, if someone was to ask your waking state character if this world was real, you would almost undoubtedly respond in a similar fashion. The three components of experience. There are three components of experience, or perception: the experiencer, perceiver, or the seer, known as drik, or drasta, in Sanskrit; the experience, perception, or the process of seeing, known as dristi, in Sanskrit; and the experienced, percept, or the seen, known as dryasya, in Sanskrit. This seer, seeing, seen triad is a more complete extension of the subject-object dichotomy. One who is self-realized, Brahma Junana, in Sanskrit, has come to understand that this triad is, in fact, singular, since all three components are located solely within one's own consciousness. That is to say, the aforementioned tripartite process can never be fundamentally separated, and understanding this fact is the basis for genuine knowledge of reality. Please refer also to Chapter 04 of this, FISH, in regard to the ideation of phenomena. In recent years, the term consciousness has been used in esoteric spiritual circles, usually capitalized, in order to refer to a far more homogeneous consciousness, PURUSA, in Sanskrit, due to the fact that the English language does not include a single word denoting the universal ground of being, for instance, Brahman, Tao, in other tongues. The word awareness, capitalized, is arguably a more apposite term for this concept. However, the reader is implored to avoid using the terms consciousness and awareness when interacting with those humans who have reached a degree of metaphysical understanding beyond the mundane conversational level, in favor of far more precise nomenclature. In brief, ultimate reality is both subjective and objective, and to ignore the latter is symptomatic of gross nescience. The networks of the human brain. Although the machinations of the human brain, or for that matter, the brain of any other animal, is not a topic that is vital for a comprehensive understanding of either consciousness, or for the understanding of life, existence, which is the focus of this book, this subsection was a late insertion, for the purpose of appealing to those rare individuals who may have an interest in a more intense appreciation of the human psyche. In the year 2001, the American neurologist, Professor Marcus E. Rakel, coined the term default mode to describe resting state brain function, which is currently known in neuroscience as the default mode network, also known as the default network, default state network, or anatomically, the medial frontoparietal network. These terms refer to a large-scale brain network, composed primarily of the dorsal medial prefrontal cortex, posterior cingulate cortex, precuneus and angular gyrus. It is best known for being active when a person is not focused on the outside world and the brain is at wakeful rest, such as during daydreaming and mind wandering. It can also be active during detailed thoughts related to external task performance. Other times that the default mode network is active include when the individual is thinking about others, thinking about themselves, remembering the past, and planning for the future. The default mode network has been shown to be negatively correlated with other networks in the brain, such as attention networks. It is potentially the neurological basis for self-referencing, autobiographical information, memories of collection of events and facts about oneself, referring to traits and descriptions of oneself, emotion of oneself, reflecting about one's own emotional state, theory of mind, thinking about the thoughts of others and what they might or might not know, understanding the emotions of other humans and empathizing with their feelings, moral reasoning, determining a just and an unjust result of an action, social evaluations, good-bad attitude judgments about social concepts, reflecting on social characteristics and status of a group, a perceived lack of social interaction, including story comprehension, understanding and remembering a narrative, story. The central executive network, or, more specifically, the lateral frontoparietal network, is a system of the human brain, crucial for actively maintaining and manipulating information in working memory, for rule-based problem solving and for decision-making in the context of goal-directed behavior. Whereas the default mode network shows activation during resting awake states, the central executive network shows activation during cognitively and emotionally challenging activities. Its major nodes include the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and the lateral posterior parietal cortex. The lateral posterior parietal cortex integrates sensory and interoceptive information in order to facilitate sustained attention. The dorsolateral prefrontal cortex manipulates material in working memory and weighs possible behavioral responses. In addition to involvement in practical decision-making, the central executive network is also implicated in task-oriented, e.g., top-down, processing, necessary for effective emotion regulation. Central executive network hypoactivity is linked with depression and various cognitive disorders. The dorsal attention network, also known anatomically as the dorsal frontoparietal network, is a large-scale brain network of the human brain that is primarily composed of the intraparietal sulcus and frontal eye fields. It is named and most known for its role in voluntary orienting of visuospatial attention. As the intraparietal sulcus and frontal eye fields are activated during many attention-demanding tasks, this network was sometimes referred to as the task-positive network, to contrast it against the task-negative network, that is, the default mode network. However, this dichotomy is now considered misleading, because the default mode network can be active in certain cognitive tasks. Though the central executive network deals with problem-solving tasks, unfortunately, it is unable to effect positive changes upon the default mode network, DMN, the latter of which is invariably fraught with psychological suffering, see Chapter 15. However, it has been scientifically demonstrated that via the practice of meditation techniques based on present moment awareness, the incessant self-absorbent worrying, hankering, and daydreaming activities of the DMN may be overcome to varying degrees. Cf. Meditate, in the glossary of this holy scripture. Comparisons, in relation to consciousness. A rather apt analogy for universal consciousness is the manner in which electricity powers a variety of appliances, according to the use and complexity of the said device. Electricity powers a washing machine in a very simple manner, to drive a large spindle for laundering clothes. However, the very same electrical energy may be used to operate a computer to manifest an astonishing range of outputs, such as playing audiovisual tracks, communication tasks, and performing extremely complex mathematical computations, depending on the computer's software and hardware. The more technologically advanced the device, the more sophisticated is its manifestation of the same electricity. Using the aforementioned computer analogy, the brain is comparatively equivalent to the computer hardware, deoxyribonucleic acid akin to the operating system working in conjunction with the memory, the intellect is equivalent to the processing unit, individuated consciousness is analogous to the software program, whilst universal awareness is likened to the electricity that enlivens the entire computer system. A person who is comatose has lost any semblance of local consciousness, yet is being kept alive by the presence of universal consciousness. The fact that many individuals report out-of-body experiences, in which consciousness departs the gross body, may support the above view. Extraordinary experiences. So-called out-of-body experiences, mentioned above, seem to be identical to dreams, except that in an out-of-body experience, there is direct perception of the waking realm as opposed to a dream realm. The precise mechanism how this occurs is currently unknown, though in the opinion of this author, it is not a difficult conundrum to explain. Once a person has become self-realized, that is, he or she has come to see that the totality of existence is naught but a phenomenal appearance of the absolute, or to put it another way, all is one. Cf. Chapter 07. There is evidence for consciousness being a universal field, in savant syndrome, a condition in which those persons with significant mental disabilities demonstrate certain abilities far in excess of the norm, such as superhuman rapid mathematical calculation, mind reading, blind seeing, or prodigious musical aptitude. Such behavior suggests that there is a universal field, possibly in holographic form, from which one can access information. Even simple artistic inspiration could be attributed to this phenomenon. The great British singer-songwriter, Sir James Paul McCartney, one day woke with the complete tune of the song, Yesterday, in his mind, after hearing it in a dream, as did his songwriting partner, John Lennon, who heard what is arguably his finest song, Number 9 Dream, as the title suggests, in a dream. American composer, Mr. Paul F. Simon had a similar experience, when the chorus of his sublime masterpiece, Bridge Over Troubled Water, simply popped into his head. I can personally attest to the phenomenon described in the previous paragraph, in which a novel piece of music is heard within a dream, since one of the hymns I wrote when I was a Roman Catholic novitiate monk, was composed after the remembrance of both the melody and the lyrics, actually a setting of the Hail Mary prayer, in English, from a dream on the morning of the 4th day of October, 1994, Christian era. This phenomenon could plausibly be relevant to the chapter on determinism, as some could argue that Sir James Paul McCartney did not really compose the tune of Yesterday, since he did not do anything in particular to produce it, other than hearing it in a dream. Of course, Chapter 11 demonstrates that not a single thought or deed of any animal, human or otherwise, is the result of free will, as we humans are naught but characters in the play of life, or the mind of God, for those who are theistic, as the great English playwright, William Shakespeare, once wrote. The hierarchy of perception, subjectivity. The typical human believes that the apparatus that knows the external world is his mind, via the five senses, but more perceptive individuals understand that the mind itself is cognizable by the intellect. Wise souls recognize that the false idea of self, the pseudo-ego, is the perceiver of their intellects, whereas awakened persons have realized that the true self is the witness of all these temporal phenomena. The true self is synonymous with meta-consciousness *, or with infinite awareness, or the undifferentiated unified field, Brahman, in Sanskrit. See Chapter 05 for the most accurate definitions of the above terms, namely, mind, intellect, and pseudo-ego. Here, meta-consciousness refers simply to the ground of all being, and not to the phenomenon of intellect, as wrongly understood by some contemporary philosophers. Just in case it was unclear in the previous paragraph, the hierarchy of consciousness is nested, meaning that the higher order subjects are cognizant of all lower subjects. Hence, the pseudo-ego knows the intellect as well as the mind, as objects of its perception. Again, it is absolutely imperative to learn the proper meaning of these terms from the previous chapter and from the glossary, for these definitions do not necessarily comport with the way that they are used in everyday language. Once this nested hierarchy of consciousness is recognized by a spiritual aspirant, one can more readily understand one's own psychological machinations, and make greater progress in yoga, i.e., religion. Please do note well the following sentence, for it is one of, if not singularly, the most important lessons that one can learn, in connection with metaphysics, the aforementioned hierarchy of consciousness, as characterized by a series of distinct subject-object relationships, that is, matter-mind, mind-intellect, intellect-ego, ego-self, self, is the secret key to unlocking the biggest questions in life. Therefore, whenever one is studying the various chapters of this book, plus the all-important glossary, as well as any other text, or verbal teaching, in relation to religion, spirituality, and/or metaphysics, one would do very well to keep in mind that life, existence, is predicated upon a subject-object paradigm. The ultimate subject is what most humans call God, or spirit, yet more accurately named Brahman, the Tao, and similar expressions, yet paradoxically, it is also the sum total of all objective realities. This is a monistic, non-dual, Advaita, in Sanskrit, grounding of reality. The persistence of the individual. The dialectic exercise in the following 3 paragraphs should help one to understand the nature of the primitive conscious observer, that is, the ultimate observer of all phenomena, in other words, the subject, which is the authentic self, as opposed to material objects. If someone were to ask you if you are the same individual that you were at birth, or even at conception, you would probably respond in the affirmative. So, then, what precisely is it about you that has remained constant since conception? In other words, what is the self-identity you had as an infant, which is the present you? It cannot be any part of your body or mind, since none of the atoms or molecules in your zygote body are extant, and you certainly did not possess a mind at conception. If you are reasonably intelligent, you may claim that your genotype is the same now as it was then. However, It has been scientifically demonstrated that one's genetic sequence can, and usually does, mutate throughout an individual's lifetime. Furthermore, nobody factually conceives of their essential nature as being merely a sequence of genes. More intelligent souls would probably counter thus: that which persists from my conception to the present moment, is my sense of self. This, too, is fallacious, since the sense of self does not emerge until at least a couple of years after birth. An infant has no ideation of itself as an individual actor. You may then say, I was a male, female, human being, but this does not specify any particular human, you, yourself. So, then, what exactly is it that remains, you, from conception until death? As demonstrated, it cannot be any particular thing, or object. That to which we refer as I am, in Sanskrit, is existence itself, which precedes any artificial sense of self, ahamkara, in Sanskrit. It is, in other terms, no objective thing, non-localized spaciousness, the subject of all subjects, the ground of all being, which is the universal self. Therefore, your essential nature is eternal being conscious bliss, incorrectly referred to as God by theists. See Chapter 10, regarding egoity. Ultimate reality. The Tao, the reality, lit. The way, the path, or the road, that can be expressed in language, is not the real Tao. All concepts are, by nature, relative, and at most, can merely point to the absolute. This explains why some branches of theology use the apophatic method of discerning the infinite, neti neti, not this, not that, in Sanskrit. Also known in Latin as via negativa, or via negationis, theology, this quasi-analytical approach to discovering the hypostatic nature of all reality, gradually negates each description about ultimate reality, but not reality itself. Ultimate reality, Brahman, in Sanskrit, from brach, literally, expansion, in English, alone is real, in the sense that it is the never mutable substratum of existence. The wisest of the philosophers of ancient India distinguished the real from the unreal, sat, asat, in Sanskrit, by whether or not the entity or thing was eternal or ephemeral, cf. Bradaranyaka Upanishad 1, 328, Bhagavad Gita 2:16, a. Altri. Gross material objects, such as one's own body, and subtle material objects, such as thoughts, are always changing, and therefore not real. Kindly refer to the glossary, where it is explained that everything, that is, every physical or conceptual object, is real, within its own category. However, ultimate reality is clearly seen by those self-realized humans who have experienced spiritual awakenings, which occur either spontaneously, or after a gradual process spanning many months, or even years, yet only intellectually understood by those who have merely studied spiritual topics, that is, those who have practiced one of the 4 systems of religion described in Chapter 16, but have yet to awaken to their essential nature. With the intent of being completely impartial to any school of philosophy, it is acceptable to refer to the physical, material, world of phenomena as real, as long as one does not confuse or conflate this relative reality as being the ineffable absolute reality. Artificial consciousness. There is nowadays much discussion pertaining to the prospect of artificial consciousness, that is, the creation of microelectronic forms of intelligence, AI, that may acquire true consciousness. Assuming one adheres to the etymological understanding of the word consciousness, it will indeed be possible for we humans to produce a device that is truly conscious. One could argue that even a relatively simple apparatus, such as a digital camera, already possesses elementary sentience. Since the lens of a camera focuses the light image of the external world, the image is projected inversely onto a mirror, and then processed by a simple computer chip, similar to how our eyes behave, in conjunction with our brains. Of course, many would vehemently object, using the following argument: but a camera does not truly know anything. It simply processes images in a thoroughly predictable manner, to which an appropriate response would be, but is that not, in fact, how conscious animals, including we humans, behave? If in doubt, I suggest that you carefully study Chapter 11 of a final instruction sheet for humanity, which clearly demonstrates that no living creature has any kind of freedom of volition whatsoever, just like any AI robot. The main differences between humans and AI contraptions are that electromechanical devices that use artificial intelligence are manufactured with inorganic materials, whilst humans are made of organic cells, and, at least at present, possess a far greater range of cognitive abilities than does AI. Apart from electronic devices that are driven by artificial intelligence programming, there also exists the concurrently developed science of transhumanism, plus the similar notion of posthumanism, which is attempting to create a whole brain emulation that will allow one, at least theoretically, to transfer one's consciousness out of the physical body and into other substrates. Those who correctly understand the nature of the human animal can plainly understand that it will never be possible for this to eventuate, since, as explained in a latter chapter, the human being is an ever-evolving process of mind and matter. In order to make it clear, if it was possible for me to transfer my memories, present thoughts, dispositions, and desires, into an electronic apparatus, the future trajectory of thoughts, desires, memories, would veer well away from my thoughts, desires, memories, had they been retained wholly within my central nervous system. And of course, my brain is not truly discrete, in the sense that it is intimately connected with the rest of my physical body, which in turn, is closely tethered to the external world. In other words, if it were, in fact, possible for one to transfer one's consciousness to a non-biological machine, it would become a unique individual within the very first second. Of course, that occurrence may or may not deter transhumanists from pursuing the utopian goals in regard to assumed immortality. If you are reading this a century after its composition, I'm sure my thesis will have been amply proven. In conclusion, it is imperative to avoid the common misunderstanding found in contemporary spiritual circles, at least among Anglophones, that universal consciousness, PURUS, or Brahman, in Sanskrit, is substantially identical with the localized consciousness of many species of animal life. This is the chief reason why it is strongly suggested that the words consciousness and awareness, even though they may be capitalized, be substituted with more apposite terms, when used in reference to ultimate reality. For those among us who are already entrenched in the so-called ultra-spiritual community, the terms Brahman and or the Tao are recommended, or else, if one feels obligated to use English terminology, the monad, as well as several phrases including the ground of all being, or the undifferentiated substratum of reality. Many leading scientists, that is, material scientists, have been heard proclaiming, "We humans do not know what even is consciousness." The reason for this claim, I believe, is simply because those physical scientists are presuming that consciousness is some kind of tangible object, when in fact, consciousness is an imperceptible subject. Ultimately, consciousness, that is, consciousness, is the subject of all subjects. As the philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer once wrote, materialism is the philosophy of the subject who forgets to take account of himself. If you remain as you are now, you are in the wakeful state. This is abolished in the dream state. The dream state disappears when you are in deep sleep. The three states come and go, but you are always there. Your real state, that of consciousness itself, continues to exist always and forever, and it is the only reality. Consciousness must first be there, before anything else can be. All inquiry of the seeker of truth must therefore relate to this consciousness, this sense of conscious presence, which as such has no personal reference to any individual. All there is consciousness. That is the source from which the manifestation has come. And the mind is merely a reflection of that consciousness. The only true meditation is the constant impersonal witnessing of all that takes place in one's life, as mere movements in the universal consciousness. The universe is not the universal consciousness, but consciousness is the universe, just as the bracelet is made of gold, but the gold is not made of the bracelet. Insofar as you keep watching the mind and discover yourself as its witness, nothing else can project itself on the screen of consciousness. This is so, because two things cannot occupy the attention at the same moment. Therefore, Delve within and find out where thoughts arise. Seek the source of all thought and acquire the self-knowledge, which is the awakening of truth. Just as the difference between the space in a pot and the space outside it disappears when the pot is demolished, so also does duality disappear when it is realized that the difference between the individual consciousness and the universal consciousness does not in fact exist. All there is consciousness, not aware of itself in its noumenal subjectivity, but perceived by itself as phenomenal manifestation in its objective expression. If this is understood in depth, there is nothing more to be understood. Ramesh S. Balsekar, Indian spiritual teacher. As a man who has devoted his whole life to the most clear-headed science, to the study of matter, I can tell you, as a result of my research about the atoms, this much: there is no matter as such. All matter originates and exists only by virtue of a force that brings the particles of an atom to vibration, and holds this most minute solar system of the atom together. We must assume behind this force the existence of a conscious and intelligent spirit. This spirit is the matrix of all matter. The first and most important quality of all scientific ways of thinking must be the clear distinction between the outer object of observation and the subjective nature of the observer. Science cannot solve the ultimate mystery of nature. And that is because, in the last analysis, we ourselves are part of nature, and therefore, part of the mystery that we are trying to solve. I regard consciousness as fundamental. I regard matter as derivative from consciousness. We cannot get behind consciousness. Everything that we talk about, everything that we regard as existing, postulates consciousness. From The Nature of Matter, a 1944 speech in Italy. Where is Science Going? 1932 book. Interview in The Observer, the 25th of January 1931. Max Carl Ernst Ludwig Planck. German theoretical physicist. N.B. Obviously, the inclusion of quotations, such as those above, which support a form of idealism, should not infer that this author endorses that metaphysical viewpoint. Since there is a dearth of famous historical figures, at least without India, who realized the truth of monism, it was thought prudent to include quotations from famous characters who proffered idealism, since idealism is one step removed from monism.